Live. Okay, for people who are joining us here, this is a live stream about my day job of working on design of Wolfram language and talking about something that's part of the infrastructure for supporting things like the physics project. This has to do with submitting remote asynchronous jobs that can be doing, well, all kinds of things. All right, let me go ahead and run. Can I be running this in 12.1, Jesse?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, you have to be.
Okay. So
now that initialization will take a little while to finish. It has to install some packets.
Okay. Okay. So what this fundamentally is a way of setting up batch jobs. This looks pretty cool. So I don't understand any of this. This looks very complicated to me.
So this remote submission environment object here is a data structure that that bundles together information that tells remote submit where on a provider, that is AWS Batch or Charity Engine, to submit a job. In the case of AWS Batch, you have to have a job queue and a job definition and an S3 bucket to point to. In the case of Charity Engine, it's much simpler. That association can be empty. But for AWS Batch, you have to have these server-side things that have to have been pre-created, which is a one-time thing. And I'm working on a method to have a streamlined process for semi-automatically creating.
So wait a minute. So you go to AWS, you give them your credit card or whatever, and you then, and does it?
An AWS account, which you have to have a credit card attached to, but you would go into the AWS console and go to the batch section and click create a job queue, enter some settings, and you'd get that string out. You'd create a job definition, enter some settings, get that string out. And as I said, I'm working on making that having a semi-automated way to do that. I think you mentioned possibly doing it in a form notebook, which I think is a reasonable idea. But well, it's a one-time, yeah. It's a one-time setup thing. You just do it once in the lifetime of your account. Or you can have multiple job queues if you want. There are advantages to having multiple queues because you can configure them different ways and use whichever one you need at a given time.
Okay. But so, I mean, should we maybe just have a form on the web where you go and you put in, I mean, I just don't know what's involved here. I don't really have a sense of what this looks like and how,
Well, it's something that's associated with your account, so you have to be authenticated. And the way, if it were done in a form notebook, the way that would work is it would use AWS Client, the other package I'm working on, which underlies RemoteSubmit, at least for AWS Batch. It would use AWS Client to handle authentication and do a series of API calls to create these resources.
We have a question from Brian on our live stream asking about Azure. I don't know whether you've been, I mean, we have all sorts of things going on with Microsoft, and I would have expected that this would that those would turn into sort of full support for Azure, but I don't know whether that's probably not something you know about.
Correct. That's not something I know about, but that's certainly a possibility. This is an extensible framework, not particularly user extensible, but it is modular. So it would be assuming Azure provides a batch submission system that's a wrapper on top of their compute infrastructure. Then it's not a huge amount of work to create an integration. The hardest part would be handling stuff like authentication and the Azure API. But I'm already doing that for AWS.
But so the authentication here is something where, how is the authentication working?
Right. Authentication, the version that you have in that notebook is, I'm sort of tiptoeing around AWS client context with some values, but I'm working on in fact, I already have working fairly well, a service connection integration with the AWS client package. So you have an AWS service and you authenticate using the normal pop-up box that you get to a dialog box to authenticate a service connection, and you put your key and secret in there. So that will be how this works, and there will be an additional parameter to the remote submission environment object, which is a service object. So you can pass one in, or if you don't pass one in, it will just create one automatically and ask.
And then it will pop up, and then it will then pop up the web page asking you to authenticate. Is that correct?
It's not a web page. It's just the dialog box, and you paste in an access key and access secret, which are the AWS credentials. It's not it's not OAuth.
I see.
But
we have a standardized way of doing that, right? Of popping up an authentication dialog.
Yes, that's correct. I'm not currently using that because it wasn't quite flexible enough to do what I need. But that's just that's.
I thought it was supposed to. Well, okay. I thought it was supposed to have the possibility that you can specify anything you want.
As far as I can tell, it only supports a single field in API key, while in the case of AWS, you need two. And actually, it's more complicated than that, because in AWS client, I also support automatic authentication, which is where it will there's a well-defined place, a file name. .aws/credentials in your home directory, where you can put a file that has credentials. That's what the AWS command line client looks into. So with the AWS client package, you can choose automatic authentication instead of manual, and then it will discover your credentials from that file. So it's even more complex. Well, there are more options than just those two fields. There's also
so are you documenting this with one of our workflows, or how is this being documented?
It's not being documented at all right now, but it will be. It's still in development.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So we have this remote submission environment object.
Right. So you'll want to evaluate that.
Okay. Okay. So this is the thing that we imagine will be actually called remote. You're calling that remote job object already. So it will be remote job submit probably.
Right. I discussed this a bit with Todd earlier this week. And if we are going to change the name, the name I think is best is something that Roman suggested, which would be batch submit, and everything would be prefixed with batch, because I think that's a little clearer than remote job. It distinguishes it even more from stuff like remote evaluate, and it also it prevents making the name even longer, because with remote job,
well, okay. Okay, question. If you say batch submit, do you imagine that there will be a local version of that at some point?
Not exclusively local, like on the local machine. I don't imagine supporting. I don't expect to support that. You had said that you think it would be a good idea to have something that people can set up on their local network, which I think is a good idea. I still believe that the best way to go about that is by supporting Kubernetes as a remote submission provider, because that saves me from having to reinvent the wheel of
sounds reasonable to me. Yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, is there a Kubernetes? Is there an orchestrator of orchestrators, so to speak, that will let you?
Kubernetes is that. Kubernetes is the orchestrator on top of. It's a higher level of abstraction than Docker. Kubernetes is the clustered abstraction that supports having a manager instance and multiple worker instances, and it supports scheduling like one-shot jobs, which is what remote submit deals with.
Okay. Okay, so then what that would look like from what you're saying is you would have, this would be batch submit. I'm almost, I have this great desire to say batch job submit, because I think that's, people understand what a batch job is. Mm-hmm. And batch, there are all kinds of other batches that, like there's this concept of batch applied, which is a whole different thing where you're, batching is not the concept here. The concept is a batch job.
Okay. Okay, I'm okay with that. What about remote map submit? What would that become? Because I'm wary of creating these giant clunky names like batch job map submit. Batch map.
Let's come to that in a minute, okay?
Sure.
But then this remote submission environment object would be batch job environment object.
Right. So now it's
it would be batch job submission.
What's that?
Dash job submission environment.
Yeah, the submission indicates that well.
I mean, maybe we can get away with not saying object here. Batch
Oh,
job.
really? I didn't think you would say that.
Well, I don't know.
It was originally remote submission environment, but then I realized that it would probably have to be object.
Yeah. Environment kind of gives the sense that it's some kind of object thing. Right. Let's keep going.
But actually, could we get rid of submission? Just call it a dash job environment object. Dash job environment object. Is that? I mean, the submission, is that really necessary?
I don't know. I mean, the environment, it would be batch job environment, and there may be a thing called batch job object, which represents the actual job itself, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, I do. It is. I'm not sure, but it is possible that adding job in then makes submission redundant, but it's still batch job submit. So the submission.
Look, I think the right thing is this thing there, and then it's batch job object.
Sure.
That represents the thing that you've got that you're calling remote job object here.
Sure.
Okay, let me try actually running it. Okay, so and the fact that the second argument, that the environment is the second argument, is kind of not obviously right to me.
It was originally the first argument, and then Roman and Todd convinced me to move it to the second argument.
Why?
Because I think the main reason was that it is optional. There's a symbol you can set, $default remote submission environment. And if you set that to a remote submission environment, then you can omit the second argument of remote submit, and it uses that. And Roman's argument was that having a second argument that's optional having the first argument of remote submit be optional is kind of weird, and I agree with that.
There's also the remote evaluate and stuff like that have the expo in the first argument. So,
well, how did remote evaluate get that?
Well, because for the same reason, because yes, remote evaluate is the same, and parallel evaluate is the same. So it's the first argument.
Well, parallel evaluate was done like 15 years ago, and it was done that way because one expected that most of the time people would have a default parallel environment.
Yes. Now with remote evaluate, it's not so clear that the default is all that useful. I mean, there will obviously be a default remote kernel, but I would expect remote evaluate to be mostly used in the two argument form. So
would I.
So it wouldn't matter, but I mean, we probably cannot have something which is consistent through all established use cases anyway. So
I personally would prefer to say machine, expo for remote evaluate. Because I think that's what, I mean, if we look at, for example, what about remote process? What is that called? Process.
Remote run process, I think.
Yes, but at process, yeah, remote run process.
Yeah, those I believe do have the IP in the first argument.
Oh, for goodness sake.
That was what I modeled my original syntax after.
I think it should be the machine in the first argument. I think that the parallel case is odd because so much of the time it will be default. Whereas remote evaluate, almost none of the time will it be default.
Yes.
Now, this case, I think this should be flipped around. It really feels unnatural to me in this order.
Okay, I can do that.
Then again, you probably only work with one remote submission environment at a time. So you might well have a $default remote submission, remote environment. And so you would be back with the
single
just
argument.
Like parallel evaluate the single argument case.
I know, but it's like the blockchain case where in principle you're always doing it with one blockchain, but in practice, I find myself really quite often, not explicitly setting. Maybe I just don't like setting global variables, but all right, let's keep going here. So we've got, Ethan on the live stream is asking about how does this relate to tasks? I think we're going to find that out, right?
Well, I don't describe it specifically in here, but but yes, there are some fairly fundamental differences.
Okay. Hans on a live stream is talking about a batch job jacket, where a jacket is the enveloping meta objects necessary to run a batch job. I think that's related to this. I don't think it's so much of a jacket as a location to send the batch job into.
Right, it's a location. It's basically the configuration that goes in, because you can also supply certain bits of configuration to RemoteSubmit directly. The configuration that goes into the environment, as opposed to into RemoteSubmit directly, is the configuration that I generally expect to be almost always persistent across multiple jobs. So in the case of AWS Batch, it's that job queue and stuff. In the case of Charity Engine, there is one optional configuration parameter called uZone devices, which tells it whether to submit it only to devices that are owned by you personally, you the user. So that's again something that you would use across multiple jobs, most likely.
Okay, is there a way of getting like a data set with all of these things shown?
No, there isn't, and it's because most of those require a network query, and also could potentially be extremely large, like gigabytes, because evaluation data has the result. I could have a data set that's just the static stuff.
Well, like a job information or something.
Information of job would.
Well, you can do that. That works.
Oh, that's cool.
That is just the static stuff.
That's very cool. Okay, so this is, gosh, this is complicated.
Well, if you go down a bit, there's the job status you can get, which by now it should be finished. Yeah.
Why is this not a success object?
Because the status is the string that's returned directly from AWS Batch, and the set of strings that can be returned varies across providers.
Okay. Given that we're calling this batch job object, do we really need the job in this in here?
That was modeled after task objects, where the property is task status.
Mm-hmm. Okay, explain why a job object is not a task object.
Because it's mostly for implementation reasons. The implementation of task objects differs a lot from what makes the most sense for remote job objects. If you look at a remote job object, the input form of it, it's just a data structure that includes stuff like the UUID. Well,
that's never going to be a good argument. The argument that it's easier to implement is never a good argument. So what is there a different? I mean, if I say cloud submit of pause 7 or something, I'm getting back a task object. And by the way, there's a bunch of differences here. Why? Oh, I see. If I say information of that, hopefully, oh, come on, that should be made to work. But okay, so you're telling me, and I don't understand why the information, well, whatever, this seems inconsistent, and I don't know why this header is so big here. Who's project manager? Carla?
Yes, I am.
So I'm complaining about that. I'm complaining about the fact there are colons here and there aren't colons here. And I'm complaining about the fact that information doesn't work on a task object. But okay, Jesse, keep going. I mean, because there's tons of stuff here that seems irrelevant to a task object. But I don't quite understand why the main queries here, like status and so on, are they the same between tasks and batch jobs, or are they not the same?
Well, I made them consistent as much as I could, just for convenience. It makes sense to have, if it's task status for task object, have it be job status for job object. But there are indeed a lot of differences. There are a lot of properties that are not that are on remote job objects that are not on task objects because they fundamentally don't apply. And there are also some properties. There aren't that many properties of task object, but there are some that aren't on remote job object.
All right, so here's a question from Ethan on our live stream. Can you take a task object and run it on a remote machine as a batch job?
A task object? Not directly, because a task object represents a task that has already been submitted, whether it be local or to the Wolfram cloud.
So your point is that it's the same thing. You can take an expression, just like you can say cloud submit, I can say batch job submit of that expression.
Correct.
Okay. So I see. So here's an evaluation result.
Yeah, that's
so
just the result. Yeah.
So if I now say batch.
Well, it's not batch now. It's remote something.
Remote. What is it? Remote submit?
Yes, remote submit.
Okay. Do I have to give the environment here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Remote submit. Oh, I don't know. $machine name environment. Okay. So I get back a remote job object.
Yeah, that'll work.
Now I say job.
You haven't put it in a variable. You want percent.
Okay. %127 sub. Okay. So now let's say I say evaluation result. I don't know whether it ran yet.
Yeah. I think it's probably no. Okay, not yet. Check the status.
Okay.
And by the way, that missing not available, it will have the status in it, because you can have a second argument to missing that's like metadata. But I had to remove it temporarily.
Do you think it should be missing, or do you think it should be a failure object?
It's not. Well, the evaluation result is what you're asking for, and the evaluation result is missing. It's not there yet.
People on our live stream are definitely not liking the distinction between task and job.
The way I understand it is that our tasks are currently tied very directly to their current uses, including kernel internal stuff and so on. So what would be involved would be to make the current tasks into a kind of abstract class.
Are we talking an implementation issue, or are we talking a design issue? Okay, I don't care about that. The fact that this is, I mean, that's not a good argument. The question is, from the point of view of user design, what makes the most sense? Right? In other words, when this comes back as a remote job object, why is it not coming back as a task object?
Well, as I said, the main reason is implementation-wise, but what makes the most sense from a design perspective is probably to have them be the same thing, to have a remote submit return a task object. But if that were the case, there would be a huge suite of differences between the properties and behavior of a task object from local submit, cloud submit, etc., and a task object from remote submit.
In particular, what are they?
Probably there are a dozen more properties, potentially a dozen more properties. A remote job object, if it comes from remote map submit, it can represent an array job that has child job objects. So I'd have to be some way of returning child task objects.
Okay.
It would be a big headache documentation wise, if nothing else, because someone mentioned bifurcation. There would essentially be a bifurcation in the documentation page for task object. Here's how it works for remote submit. Here's how it works for everything else.
Okay, so let me just understand. So I mean, if I go to task object right now,
and I think your job is finished, by the way.
Okay, but if I go to task object right now, these properties of task object that are listed here, which ones of these apply to batch jobs?
Evaluation result, task environment, task status, task type, task UUID.
Now, right now, we don't have a scheduled batch task.
Correct.
Job.
That would be significantly more complicated to support.
Okay. I mean, the main issue here is not, having a function batch job submit with all kinds of tentacles. That's okay, because that's like saying, local submit, session submit, and so on. The issue is whether the returned object.
The task object.
Okay, I understand the implementation, but that's not what the issue is. The issue is from a user point of view.
I think a big question though is whether if we made these into task objects, would they support the task object API, which is task abort, task execute, task remove, task resume, all the task functions? Can they meaningfully work on your remote job objects?
Only task abort and potentially task remove, but it would mean something. It would be semantically different. Task suspend doesn't make sense. Task resume doesn't make sense.
Okay, so task abort. How do you do task abort right now with your
remote job abort?
Oh, for goodness sake. Okay, let's take a look here at my so I should be able to say, where was my,
I think you're further down. Yeah.
Okay, so %127 sub evaluation result. Oh, I had it right there. Okay. It's interesting what the names of their machines are.
Just a little thing about job status. Now, you said that the return value depends on the back end, which makes sense, but it still would be useful to have a standard way of finding out whether it finished.
There is. Todd suggested this. There are the properties job succeeded queue, job failed queue, and job in progress queue, which return booleans.
Which there's no point in us trying to, I mean, it's just a blob of text, basically.
Correct. And it's useful if something goes horribly wrong and something crashes, because this will still be there if the job crashes, because it's a direct console log.
And we don't have any similar such thing for our task objects, right?
Correct. Doesn't make any sense for task objects.
Why not?
Because this is the standard out of a process. Task objects don't have processes unless they're subkernels, but even then, I don't think anything's going to standard out.
Okay.
But we do have something like this for cloud submit. You know, there is an output page, you know, for a cloud submit task.
Where is
but
it?
Is that?
I haven't seen it in a long time. I don't remember what's in it, but I know.
Where is it? Where is it? How do I get to it?
I can't. It's like the URL for the cloud object for the cloud. You know, when you do a cloud submit, you get
a task object.
Yeah, I think in the task object there must be a cloud object that has that you can go to see the progress.
I'm not seeing it.
I can't remember. I never used cloud submit, but and there is a.
There's something in a generator that gives you a report. My gosh, every single person who's joining this live stream is asking, what's the difference between a task and a job? This is not a good sign.
Right, but I do think, let's go back. I mean, let's talk about the tasks API, right? If the tasks API, all the functions that operate on tasks, you know, most of them don't work with these things. That's a good argument that they shouldn't be tasks.
Well, it's not that good an argument. If you have to have your own sort of shadow version of a batch job abort, like a task abort.
Right.
The fact that there are
alternatives.
For what it's worth, I also support task abort. If you give task abort a remote job object, it works. But that's not documented.
Now you're really confusing.
So the proper way to do it would be to design a generic task API that covers all the cases we're now looking at, and then re-implementing our count task in terms of that and the remote job in terms of that.
Well, I mean, cosmetically, how difficult would it be for you to just make this be a task object? With certain...
I could do it, but it would be a major hack. It would not be done correctly. To do it correctly would require completely tearing out the implementation of task object. I believe. I'm not certain of that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case.
And what about other AWS and other cloud provider services that aren't batch services?
Those are outside of the scope of this.
I understand that, but I want to know what they will look like, because if they correspond to something, you know, yet a different mechanism for maintaining the state of the cloud providers, you know, let's say you spin up a machine in Azure or whatever, and you're going to do things with it. What does that look like here? I understand that this doesn't look like anything because this is just a batch queue, and you know, the fact what machine you get is kind of irrelevant.
Right. Well,
aren't all those things synchronous operations, Jesse? All those other things are synchronous operations.
Like what things?
You know, well, I don't know.
Yes, once you spun up a machine.
It's spinning something up and then evaluating, you know.
Look, for example, you could spin up a container with a Wolfram application server in it and be talking to that. And there will be service, I mean, they may already exist, service execute things for spinning up, for initiating. Yeah, I don't know exactly how those will work, and I don't know whether those are related at all to this. Go ahead.
I don't believe they are. I do have. I mean, I can show you. I'd have to send it to you, but I can show you what service objects, AWS service objects, look like. But they're not. I mean, that's a lower level way of accessing AWS APIs, whether it be AWS Batch or some other one of the other 200 services. That's lower level than RemoteSubmit. RemoteSubmit is a provider independent as much as possible wrapper that emits a fairly standardized.
Okay, so this thing here, I suspect I suggested this, but I don't know whether we want to be as general as that. So, you know, look, what I'm concluding here is that this concept of a batch job, what's really bothering me is if we want to change this at some point in the future and have this merge with tasks, what would have to happen is batch job submit would have to start returning a task object instead of a batch job object. But you see, I think this could go in two different ways. I think it could be that there's a whole different world of batch jobs that itself gets a lot of complicated hair, and that we're going to be very happy we have a separate batch job submit because we can put all that hair in there without having to, you know, make the task interface more complicated. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that people will view these just like tasks that you can submit on local machines and so on, and that then we will want to merge it with sort of more local task objects.
Well, I, for one, am certain that I would be happy to have something else that can grow as much hair as it needs without caring about how it relates.
Well, so that's what I suspect we should end up doing, and that a batch job. I mean, we should describe this as being, for now, a remote batch job.
I think that's literally what it says on the page, on the docs page.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, fine. Okay. Let's take a look here. Is this guide page going to work? Yes, it does. Good.
It took me like 15 minutes to get those links to work.
Well, thanks. Okay. Remote batch jobs. Okay. So this becomes, oh boy, just like we have to have a tasks function. A list of submitted jobs. So is that something that I would say? So this would say remote jobs, and can I say open close, or do I have to say the environment?
You have to give the environment. If you do open close, it uses the default, of course. So these are all things I've submitted because we're on the same account.
Okay. So are they finished, or do they indicate that they're finished here?
Not in there. You'd have to query the job status, but you can say remote jobs, and I think you can give it as the second argument. You can give a status like succeeded, and it will query only. It will give you only the jobs in that status. Oh no, I'm wrong about that. Sorry, the second argument is something else. Never mind.
Why does this not come back and write into some table somewhere when it knows that one of these jobs is finished? Why doesn't it do that and be able to modify what this blob looks like?
I think because that would, well, you're not suggesting having it be dynamic, just having.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm suggesting that it writes that once it knows that it can indicate that this thing is finished. I mean, I would like to be able to get a list of the active jobs.
Right. Well, okay, this isn't, okay, there is something I should mention, which is for AWS Batch, finished, completed jobs, whether they succeeded or failed, only stay around for 24 hours. So this list will give you all running jobs and all finished jobs that have finished in the last 24 hours.
Okay, so by the way, so people are still complaining about jobs versus tasks, and that, I mean, okay, let's take a look at a little bit more here. And do you have the Charity Engine version of this also?
Not of remote map submit, only remote submit.
Can we see the remote submit for Charity Engine?
It looks exactly the same, but you can go into the remote submit ref page. I think there's an example under scope. And click the link for provider pages Charity Engine. So this is a mock-up of pages that will be like entity ref pages that are for reference for specific providers that document everything that's specific to that provider. So you can check under examples. There should be an example, but you should see the remote submit part looks exactly the same.
Okay, explain from the beginning why. Yeah, I mean, so Hans on our live stream is pointing out that jobs are a more sophisticated concept than tasks, and that in principle a job could contain tasks.
Not in any native way, but you could do task. You could do local submit or session submit within a job if you so wished. I'm not sure why you would want to do that, but yes, that is possible. Yes. Which is not something that fits into the existing design of tasks.
Look, the problem is these providers, and I don't know, you should, if you haven't looked at the Azure case, there's certainly a bunch of people in the company who know about the Azure case, and you should probably check with them. But the fact you managed to get this framework to work with both AWS and Charity Engine, I think, is a good sign, because they are somewhat different kinds of things.
Yes, they are quite different.
Okay, let me just understand this map submit thing. Someone here is pointing out that they like C# and Python's async await pattern. That's much more what we have for tasks. This is not this is a batch job. It's not a task that has our task system has all these kinds of handlers and callbacks and so on. This has no callback possibility whatsoever. This is a thing where it's being sent to a random machine in the darkest data center in the world type thing to get executed.
Correct. And I want to mention one other user level difference between jobs and tasks, which is just a matter of how they're used. It's perfectly reasonable to have a batch job that runs for several days. While that's probably technically supported in the task framework, but it's not something that you would normally do, at least how tasks work right now.
Well, because tasks tend to be attached to a particular session, right?
They have to be attached to a particular session. That is a implementation detail, but that is a fundamental detail of how task objects work. Cloud task objects.
Calling tasks is something which is anchored to a session, whereas a job is something that is just running out there in the world, independent of. It's not quite right, because a scheduled task is not anchored to a session. A scheduled task.
I'm pretty sure it is.
It's not. It runs in the cloud. I've had scheduled tasks.
Oh, on the cloud, yes. Yeah. Clouds, yes, sure.
Right.
But still, I'm pretty sure it's kind of hard to recover results from a cloud task object that's in a session other than the one from which it's submitted. Like,
well, the handlers will not work. The handlers are a different thing. Right. The handlers are intended for a thing that has has a handle to that particular object, to that particular task, and then you can have callbacks and so on working from that task.
Yeah.
Let's understand remote map submit. What is this doing?
Sure. This is creating an array job on AWS Batch that contains multiple child jobs. This is how you'd handle a situation where you have maybe several million items in a list, and you want to apply a function to each, like you might use map or parallel map. Now you don't want to submit one job that does all those 50 million or whatever, because that will take a while. There's a limit on how fast that can get, because there's a limit on how many CPUs you can have attached to a single job. But you also don't want to submit 50 million individual jobs, because that overwhelms what these batch providers are capable of doing. They won't let you do it. So this automatically chunks up a big list into multiple smaller lists and submits each one as a child job of an array job. An array job is something that's natively supported in AWS Batch. So the visualization there shows you.
Which, by the way, has horrible fonts, but yes, okay.
And it has not been designed. It's
okay, fine. Okay. Job packing visualization. So is this nestable many levels or what?
No, it's only, but it might if the packing is more complex. Can you go to the remote map submit ref page, please? Linked in the guide page. There are some example of those visualizations from more complex packing strategies, because you can customize how it.
How do these packing strategies relate to our parallel evaluate strategy?
They are modeled directly off of them, but they are not the same.
Why are they not being? I mean, our parallel evaluation stuff has a different display.
Well, it doesn't have any display, does it?
Well, it has a status page. It has a status thing you can bring up that's showing you what's. It doesn't show you how it's clustered.
No, it shows what the kernels are doing, but that's not related to.
Right. Yeah, that's different.
But I mean, obviously, now that we are using these visualizations, I mean, it would certainly make sense for me to add stuff like that to a parallel code.
Yeah. Can you go down to the method under the options section, examples options method?
Oh boy, what is this?
The grid?
Yes, that's a grid of
child jobs.
Of which there are 10 here with 2 blanks.
Yeah, Max pointed that out too, that I should not have the mesh in the blank section. That's just that it didn't.
Okay.
10 doesn't
right,
doesn't divide. 10 doesn't go into a square.
Okay, where am I looking?
Options method.
I unfortunately need to wrap this meeting very, very soon. I think. Okay, look. Gosh. The most important thing, I mean, you've managed to get all this stuff actually working. Is that the basic picture here?
Correct.
That's very nice. There are clearly some, okay, so this batch job map submit. That is a very weird concept. I mean, why? Boy.
I mean, it's like parallel map, right? So conceptually, you submit. I mean, what you really want is something like remote submit of map f, expo, but you want that map to be done on the outside, and so it will distribute the jobs into partial maps. So
right, but the parallel stuff is more full featured in actually like looking into an expression and figuring out how to parallelize it. I just support map at one level. You can't do multiple levels. It's pretty basic. So like I wouldn't want to.
Yeah, right. The issue here is, okay, we've got parallel map, which is doing something different. I mean, we've got 3 different mechanisms here. We've got parallel kernels, we've got tasks, and now we've got jobs. Now, the truth is, in the general world of computing, these things are handled somewhat differently.
Yeah, and I should mention there can also be parallel kernels inside a job.
And you could say parallel map inside a parallel map, inside a batch job map submit.
Not inside remote, batch job map submit. You can do parallel map inside remote submit. For remote map submit, you can give it that same provider settings option instead of vCPU number, and then it will automatically just use parallel map instead of map inside each job, because each job will have multiple CPUs available to it.
Boy, this is complicated.
But that aspect is abstracted away from the user. That's not.
So let me ask a practical question. So if I'm doing like some random machine learning training, what is my actual workflow? I mean, am I uploading a ton of stuff like for AWS to S3, and then I'm just saying which I represent by some kind of external.
The uploading to S3 is handled automatically. In the agenda, can you go up to remote submit? The end of the remote submit section. There's a down a little, down more. input files. So you can specify a local file to be uploaded alongside your job code, and then it's made available. It's automatically downloaded into the working directory before it launches into your code, so you can import it. But if you don't want to deal with files, you can also, it has include definition semantics. So you can also, if you just have a variable in your session that's already defined that has a bunch of stuff in it, you can use that in your code, and it will capture that and upload it.
All right, so what you're doing is you're creating essentially a local file system. This job input files is specifying in the same way that file system scan or file system map lets you have a list of, I'm still a little bit confused because that's the content. Find file is just giving you,
it's a path, yes.
Yeah, I understand. It's a path, so it's not the content. So this is a mapping between your sort of cherooted local file system in the batch job and files on your machine that this is coming from.
It's very simple. It doesn't support directories or anything. You just give it a name. But I think that's sufficient.
I think it's a simple file upload, and I mean, the find file is local, right?
Yeah, and I should mention you can also give a byte array instead of a path, and it will upload that if you so wanted.
Okay.
And you mentioned external storage object. If you scroll down a little bit more, there is something that's not implemented yet. But what I hope to have this, I hope to integrate this input file system with the external storage system. But there are external storage is currently not extensible enough for me to do that.
I have to wrap this meeting. I have another one coming up in just a few minutes here.
Sure.
And I need my lunch. Look, there's a lot of really nice stuff here. There were a few design changes that we know we need based on this. I think we still need to spend a bit more time with this. But I mean, this is definitely coming to closure. I think you really should look at the Azure stuff. People there. All right, have to go here. Okay, thanks to folks on the live stream for your input. And